The morning mist hung low over the endless rows of corn that stretched across the Iowa countryside, creating an almost ethereal blanket over the farmland. In the distance, the rumble of a massive engine cut through the peaceful silence, like thunder announcing an approaching storm. This wasn't just any ordinary farm vehicle making its way through the fields. This was the sound of something much more powerful, something that would soon become the center of one of Iowa's most puzzling mysteries. Brian Ross had always been different from the other farmers in Cedar County. While his neighbors were content with their standard tractors and pickup trucks, Brian had spent the better part of 3 years building something extraordinary in his barn. The monster truck that emerged from those weathered wooden doors was a mechanical marvel that commanded respect and admiration from anyone who laid eyes on it. Standing nearly 8 feet tall on massive tires that could crush a car, the truck was Brian's masterpiece. The engine alone was worth more than most people's annual income, a supercharged V8 that could produce enough power to pull a house from its foundation. Every bolt, every wire, every custom modification had been carefully crafted by Brian's own hands during the long winter months when the fields lay dormant under Iowa's harsh snow. The project had begun as a way to cope with the isolation that came with farming life. After his wife Sarah had passed away from cancer 2 years earlier, Brian found himself struggling with the overwhelming silence that filled his farmhouse each evening. The workshop became his sanctuary, a place where the sound of grinding metal and the smell of motor oil could drown out the memories that threatened to consume him. His neighbors initially thought he had lost his mind. Margaret Kowalski, who lived on the adjacent farm, often complained to her husband about the noise that echoed across the fields at all hours of the night. "That man is going to wake the dead with all that racket," she would say, not knowing how prophetic her words might prove to be. But as the months passed and the truck began to take shape, even the skeptics had to admit that Brian was creating something remarkable. Local mechanics would drive from towns as far as 50 miles away just to catch a glimpse of the engineering marvel taking shape in the old barn. The suspension system alone was a work of art, incorporating elements from military vehicles and racing cars to create something that could handle terrain no conventional vehicle could navigate. The local community had grown accustomed to the thunderous roar that echoed across the farmland whenever Brian took his creation for a test drive. Children would run to their windows, farmers would pause their work, and even the livestock seemed to recognize the distinctive sound that announced Brian's presence. It wasn't just a vehicle to him, it was a symbol of everything he had worked for, a testament to his mechanical genius and unwavering determination. Brian's farm sat on 200 acres of prime Iowa soil, land that had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather, William Ross, had purchased the property in 1923 with money saved from working in the coal mines of Pennsylvania. The soil was rich and dark, perfect for growing the corn that had sustained the Ross family through the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and countless economic challenges. The corn grew tall and thick, creating natural corridors between the rows that stretched for what seemed like miles. During harvest season, these pathways became highways for the massive combines that would strip the fields bare. But in the early summer months, they formed a maze of green walls that could easily swallow a person whole. Brian knew every inch of his property with the intimacy that only comes from a lifetime of working the same land. He could navigate the fields in complete darkness, guided by subtle changes in elevation and the feel of the soil beneath his feet. The property had its own personality, its own moods that changed with the seasons and weather patterns. There was something special about the 2006 growing season. The corn had responded to the perfect combination of rainfall and sunshine with unprecedented growth. By early June, the stalks were already approaching 7 feet in height, and agricultural experts were predicting record yields across the entire county. Brian took pride in knowing that his fields were among the most productive in the region, a testament to generations of careful stewardship and modern farming techniques. On this particular morning in June 2006, Brian had risen before dawn as he always did. The weather forecast called for clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect conditions for what he had planned. He had been working on some modifications to the truck's suspension system, and today would be the ultimate test of his engineering skills. The plan was simple: take the monster truck through the most challenging terrain his property had to offer, pushing both machine and driver to their limits. As Brian made his final preparations in the barn, checking fluid levels and inspecting every component one last time, he couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different somehow. Perhaps it was the way the morning light filtered through the barn doors, Or maybe it was the unusual silence that seemed to blanket the entire farm. Even the birds, which typically filled the air with their cheerful songs, seemed subdued and distant. The truck's interior was as impressive as its exterior. Brian had installed a custom dashboard with gauges monitoring every aspect of the vehicle's performance. GPS navigation, satellite radio, and emergency communication equipment were all integrated into a control panel that would have been at home in a military command vehicle. The seats were specially designed to provide maximum comfort and support during extended off-road adventures. Brian had also installed a comprehensive recording system that would document every aspect of the day's journey. Multiple cameras captured views from inside and outside the vehicle, while sophisticated sensors monitored engine performance, GPS coordinates, and environmental conditions. He planned to use this data to fine-tune the truck's performance and document his achievement for posterity. The truck fired up with a roar that shook the very foundations of the barn. Brian felt the familiar surge of adrenaline as the powerful engine responded to his touch, the vibrations traveling through the steering wheel and into his bones. This was where he felt most alive, behind the wheel of his mechanical creation, ready to conquer whatever challenges the Iowa countryside could throw at him. The morning sun climbed higher as Brian guided his monster truck out of the barn and onto the dirt road that bordered his cornfield. The massive tires left deep impressions in the soft earth, marking his path like the footprints of some prehistoric beast. He paused at the edge of the field, surveying the endless rows of corn that stretched out before him like a green ocean. The corn had grown exceptionally well this year, standing nearly 7 feet tall and creating walls so thick that visibility was limited to just a few feet in any direction. Brian had driven through these fields countless times before, but never with his monster truck, and certainly never when the corn was this dense. The challenge excited him. This would be the ultimate test of his vehicle's capabilities and his own skill as a driver. Before entering the field, Brian activated all of his recording equipment and checked his communication systems one final time. The GPS showed his exact position at the northwestern corner of his property, and the satellite radio was picking up a clear signal from a station in Des Moines. Everything was functioning perfectly, just as he had designed it. With a deep breath and a firm grip on the steering wheel, Brian pressed the accelerator and plunged into the cornfield. The massive truck pushed through the stalks like a ship cutting through waves, sending showers of leaves and debris flying in all directions. The sound was incredible. The roar of the engine mixed with the snapping and crackling of corn stalks being crushed beneath the enormous tires. The initial progress was exactly what Brian had hoped for. The truck's powerful engine never hesitated as it pushed through the dense vegetation, and the suspension system absorbed the impact of hidden obstacles with remarkable efficiency. The massive tires provided excellent traction, allowing the vehicle to maintain steady forward momentum even when encountering patches of soft soil or hidden rocks. Navigation became increasingly difficult as Brian ventured deeper into the field. The GPS unit mounted on his dashboard showed his position, but the dense corn made it impossible to see any landmarks or reference points. He relied on his intimate knowledge of the property, following the natural contours of the land and the subtle variations in the soil that only a lifelong farmer would recognize. The recording equipment was capturing everything perfectly. The external cameras showed the corn stalks parting before the truck's massive front bumper, while the internal cameras documented Brian's concentration and the steady performance of all vehicle systems. The data being collected would provide valuable insights into both the truck's capabilities and the unique challenges of navigating through such dense vegetation. As he drove deeper into the field, Brian began to notice something strange. The corn seemed to be growing thicker and taller than he remembered, creating an almost tunnel-like effect that blocked out most of the sunlight. The familiar landmarks he had used for navigation his entire life seemed to have disappeared, replaced by an endless maze of identical green corridors that all looked exactly the same. The GPS unit began to flicker and lose signal, a common occurrence in rural Iowa where cell towers were sparse and satellite coverage could be spotty. Brian wasn't particularly concerned. He had been navigating these fields long before GPS technology existed, and he trusted his instincts to guide him home. What he didn't realize was that he was about to venture into a part of his own property that he had never fully explored, a section where the corn grew in unusual patterns, and the land itself seemed to play tricks on even the most experienced farmer. The truck's performance remained impressive despite the challenging conditions. The engine maintained its powerful rhythm, and all systems continued to function within normal parameters. Brian felt a surge of satisfaction as he realized that months of careful planning and engineering were paying off exactly as he had hoped. However, as the journey continued, Brian began to notice subtle changes in his surroundings that didn't quite make sense. The corn rows seemed to be arranged in patterns that didn't match his memory of how the field had been planted. The spacing between rows appeared inconsistent, and some sections seemed to curve in ways that defied the geometric precision of modern farming techniques. The temperature inside the cab began to fluctuate in ways that the climate control system couldn't explain. One moment it would be comfortably cool, and the next it would feel oppressively warm, despite the air conditioning running at full capacity. Brian attributed these variations to the dense vegetation affecting air circulation, but the changes seemed too dramatic and sudden to be explained by natural causes. The satellite radio began to experience interference, with clear signals suddenly dissolving into static before returning just as mysteriously. The GPS unit continued to lose and regain signal in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic, as if something was deliberately interfering with the satellite communications. Brian pressed on, determined to complete his planned route through the field. He had mapped out a course that would take him through the most challenging terrain on his property, testing every aspect of the truck's capabilities while documenting the entire journey for future reference. The mechanical problems he was beginning to experience only added to the challenge, pushing both man and machine to their limits. The engine continued to roar with power, but Brian began to notice subtle changes in its sound. The pitch seemed slightly different, and there was an occasional hesitation that hadn't been there before. He made a mental note to check the fuel system when he returned to the barn, but for now the truck was still performing admirably, despite the challenging conditions. The deeper Brian traveled into the cornfield, the more disoriented he became. What should have been a familiar journey through his own property had transformed into something entirely different. The corn rows seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, creating a labyrinth that defied his understanding of the land he had worked his entire life. According to his calculations, he should have reached the eastern boundary of his property hours ago, but the corn continued to stretch ahead of him with no sign of the fence line that marked the edge of his land. The GPS unit had become completely unreliable, showing his position jumping erratically across the map in ways that made no logical sense. The monster truck continued to push forward, but Brian began to notice that the engine was running rougher than before. Small vibrations that hadn't been there at the start of his journey were now becoming more pronounced, and the smooth power delivery he was accustomed to was being interrupted by occasional stutters and hesitations. He reduced his speed, hoping to nurse the vehicle through whatever mechanical issue was developing. The recording equipment was still functioning, but the data it was collecting made no sense. The external cameras showed the same endless corridors of corn, but the GPS coordinates being logged suggested that the truck was covering impossible distances and moving in directions that contradicted the visual evidence. The environmental sensors were detecting temperature and humidity fluctuations that seemed to follow no natural pattern. As he navigated through what seemed like the 1,000th identical corridor of corn, Brian realized that he had been driving for much longer than intended. The sun, which had been low on the horizon when he started, was now directly overhead, indicating that several hours had passed. His fuel gauge showed that he had consumed far more gas than such a journey should have required, suggesting that he had been traveling in circles or covering much more ground than he had planned. The communication systems were becoming increasingly unreliable. The satellite radio now produced nothing but static, and his cell phone showed no signal despite being equipped with a powerful external antenna designed for rural use. The isolation was becoming complete. He was alone in the heart of his own cornfield, with no way to communicate with the outside world and no reliable means of navigation. Brian decided to stop and assess the situation more carefully. He brought the truck to a halt in what appeared to be a slightly wider section between the corn rows and shut off the engine. The sudden silence was overwhelming after hours of listening to the powerful motor, and for the first time, he truly appreciated how isolated he had become. The engine problems were becoming more severe. What had started as minor hesitations had evolved into significant power losses and irregular firing patterns. Brian could hear components under the hood that didn't sound right, and he began to worry that his masterpiece might suffer permanent damage if he continued to push it through the challenging terrain. Opening the hood revealed a troubling sight. Several components appeared to be overheating, despite the cooling system functioning normally, and there were signs of stress on parts that should have been able to handle much more punishment than they had received. Brian's mechanical expertise told him that something was fundamentally wrong, but he couldn't identify the specific cause of the problems. The temperature readings from the engine sensors were inconsistent with what Brian could observe directly. Some components showed normal operating temperatures, while others indicated dangerous overheating, despite being located in the same general area of the engine bay. The cooling system was circulating fluid normally, and the radiator fans were operating correctly, yet the thermal patterns made no logical sense. As he worked to diagnose the issues, Brian became aware of how quiet the cornfield had become. There were no birds singing, no insects buzzing, no wind rustling through the stalks. The silence was so complete that it seemed unnatural, as if the entire world had been muted. Even his own breathing and heartbeat seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. The corn around him appeared different from what he remembered planting. The stalks seemed taller and more robust, with leaves that were unusually broad and thick. The color was a deeper, richer green than he had ever seen in his fields, and the ears of corn were developing far ahead of schedule for this time of year. Brian noticed that his watch had stopped working, the digital display frozen at the exact time he had entered the cornfield. His backup timepiece, a mechanical watch that had belonged to his grandfather, was still running, but seemed to be moving much slower than normal. Time itself seemed to be behaving strangely in this part of the field. The temperature seemed to be dropping despite the bright sunshine overhead, and Brian noticed that the corn around him appeared to be wilting slightly, as if something was draining the life from the plants. He dismissed these observations as products of stress and fatigue, focusing instead on the mechanical problems that threatened to strand him in the middle of his own property. The recording equipment was still functioning, but the data it was collecting became increasingly bizarre. The cameras showed the same views of corn stalks and clear sky, but the timestamps were jumping erratically, sometimes showing dates and times that were clearly impossible. The environmental sensors were detecting readings that defied explanation, atmospheric pressure fluctuations that would be associated with severe weather despite the clear skies overhead. After an hour of troubleshooting, Brian managed to get the engine running again, but it was clear that the truck was operating far below its normal capacity. The power output was reduced significantly, and the engine ran rough and irregular. He knew that he needed to get back to the barn as quickly as possible before the situation deteriorated further. The journey back proved even more challenging than the initial trip into the field. The corn seemed to have grown thicker and taller during the time he had been stopped, making navigation even more difficult. The paths that he thought he had followed earlier seemed to have disappeared, replaced by solid walls of vegetation that showed no signs of having been disturbed. Brian's confidence in his ability to navigate by instinct was shaken as he found himself in areas of the field that he didn't recognize. The topography seemed wrong, with hills and valleys that didn't match his memory of the land. The soil composition appeared different, with patches of clay and rock that shouldn't have existed in his carefully maintained fields. The engine problems continued to worsen as he struggled to find his way home. The powerful motor that had performed flawlessly for months was now barely able to maintain forward momentum. Strange noises emanated from under the hood, grinding, clicking, and whining sounds that suggested serious mechanical damage was occurring. 3 days passed before anyone realized that Brian Ross was missing. His nearest neighbor, Tom Henderson, had grown accustomed to hearing the monster truck's distinctive roar echoing across the fields, and when the silence stretched longer than usual, he decided to investigate. Finding Brian's farmhouse empty and the barn doors standing wide open, Tom immediately contacted the Cedar County Sheriff's Department. Tom had been Brian's closest friend since childhood, and he knew better than anyone how important the monster truck project had been to Brian's emotional recovery after Sarah's death. The sight of the empty barn, with tools scattered around and clear evidence that Brian had been preparing for a major test drive, filled Tom with a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. The search began at dawn on the 4th day. Sheriff Mike Patterson assembled a team that included local law enforcement, volunteer firefighters, and several farmers who knew the Ross property intimately. They spread out across the 200 acres of cornfield, calling Brian's name and listening for any response that might indicate his location. The initial search efforts were hampered by the unusual density of the corn crop. Agricultural experts brought in to assist the search team confirmed that the growth patterns in Brian's fields were unlike anything they had seen before. The corn was not only taller and thicker than normal for the season, but it was also growing in configurations that didn't match standard planting patterns. The search proved more challenging than anyone had anticipated. The corn had grown so thick and tall that visibility was limited to just a few feet in any direction, and the maze-like quality of the field made it easy for even experienced searchers to become disoriented. Radio communication was spotty at best, and several team members had to be guided back to safety after losing their bearings in the green labyrinth. Search dogs brought in from the state capital were unable to pick up Brian's scent trail beyond the immediate area around the barn. The animals seemed agitated and confused when taken into the cornfield, behaving in ways that their handlers had never seen before. Several of the dogs refused to enter certain sections of the field entirely, despite being specifically trained for search and rescue operations. Helicopter overflights provided little useful information due to the dense canopy created by the unusually tall corn. Thermal imaging equipment detected several heat signatures that initially raised hopes among the search team, but ground investigation revealed these to be nothing more than patches of decomposing vegetation or small animals. It was Tom Henderson who made the first significant discovery. Following what appeared to be a path of broken and crushed corn stalks, he stumbled upon something that made him call immediately for backup. There, sitting alone in a small clearing roughly 2 miles from the barn, was Brian's monster truck engine. The massive V8 motor sat upright on the ground, as if it had been carefully placed there by some giant hand. Every bolt, every wire, every component was exactly as it should be, showing no signs of damage or forced removal. The engine appeared to be in perfect working condition, as if it had simply been lifted out of the truck and set down in the middle of the cornfield. Sheriff Patterson arrived within minutes, followed by the rest of the search team. The sight that greeted them defied explanation. The engine was completely intact and showed no evidence of the mechanical problems that Brian had been experiencing during his final journey. More puzzling still, there was no sign of the rest of the truck. No chassis, no tires, no body panels, nothing except the pristine engine sitting alone among the corn stalks. The area around the engine was carefully cordoned off and treated as a crime scene, despite the lack of any evidence suggesting foul play. Forensic experts from the state crime lab were brought in to examine every aspect of the discovery, but their investigation raised more questions than it answered. The engine showed no signs of having been forcibly removed from the vehicle. All mounting points were clean and undamaged, with no evidence of cutting tools or explosive devices having been used. The electrical connections had been disconnected with precision that suggested either advanced mechanical knowledge or the use of sophisticated equipment. More mysteriously, the engine appeared to be in better condition than it should have been given its age and the stress it had endured during the test drive. Components that should have shown wear and tear looked as if they had just been manufactured. Fluids that should have been contaminated with debris from the cornfield were clean and clear. The search expanded to cover every inch of the Ross property and extended into neighboring farms. Helicopters were brought in to provide aerial surveillance, and specialized search dogs were deployed to track any scent that might lead to Brian's location. Despite these extensive efforts, no trace of Brian Ross or the remainder of his monster truck was ever found. Ground-penetrating radar was used to scan the area around where the engine was discovered, searching for any signs of buried debris or disturbed soil. The results showed unusual patterns in the earth that didn't match natural geological formations, but excavation revealed nothing more than slightly compacted soil and root systems that seemed unusually developed for the time of year. The investigation continued for weeks, with law enforcement officials exploring every possible explanation for the mysterious disappearance. Mechanical experts examined the recovered engine and found it to be in excellent condition, showing no signs of the problems that should have forced Brian to stop his journey. The corn around the discovery site was tested for any unusual chemicals or environmental factors that might explain the strange circumstances, but all results came back normal. Federal investigators were eventually called in due to the unusual nature of the case and the possibility that advanced technology might have been involved. The FBI's Technical Analysis Unit conducted extensive tests on the engine and the surrounding area, but their sophisticated equipment detected nothing that could explain how a massive monster truck could simply vanish while leaving its engine behind in perfect condition. Local farmers reported that the corn in the area where the engine was found grew unusually well that year, producing yields that exceeded all expectations. The stalks in that particular section grew taller and stronger than anywhere else on the property, as if they had been nourished by some unknown source. Some attributed this to coincidence, while others whispered about more mysterious explanations. The recording equipment that Brian had installed in the truck was never found, despite extensive searches using metal detectors and other specialized equipment. The data that might have explained what happened during those final hours remained as elusive as Brian himself. Agricultural scientists studying the unusual growth patterns in Brian's cornfield published papers suggesting that unknown environmental factors might have contributed to the exceptional crop yields. However, attempts to replicate the conditions in controlled experiments failed to produce similar results, leaving the scientific community as baffled as law enforcement. The case of Brian Ross and his vanishing monster truck became one of Cedar County's most enduring mysteries. The engine was eventually returned to Brian's family, who kept it in the barn where the truck had been built, a silent monument to a man whose passion for mechanical perfection had led him into the heart of an unexplained phenomenon. Insurance investigators spent months trying to determine what had happened to the expensive vehicle, but eventually classified the case as an unexplained loss. The payout to Brian's estate was one of the largest in the company's history for a case involving a missing person and vehicle. Years later, farmers in the area still report hearing the distant rumble of a powerful engine echoing across the cornfields on quiet summer mornings. Whether these sounds are echoes of memory, tricks of the wind, or something more mysterious, no one can say for certain. What remains undisputed is that Brian Ross drove his monster truck into that cornfield on a bright June morning in 2006 and simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and the pristine engine that continues to puzzle investigators to this day. The Ross farm was eventually sold to a neighboring family, but the section of cornfield where the engine was discovered remains untouched. Local residents have come to regard it as a place of mystery and respect, a reminder that even in the familiar landscapes of rural Iowa, there are still secrets waiting to be discovered and mysteries that may never be solved. Tom Henderson, now in his 70s, still visits the site every year on the anniversary of Brian's disappearance. He brings fresh flowers and spends a few quiet moments remembering his friend, hoping that someday the mystery will be solved and Brian will finally be able to rest in peace. The monster truck engine remains in the Ross family barn, carefully maintained by Brian's nephew, who inherited the property. Occasionally, mechanical enthusiasts make pilgrimages to see the legendary engine, drawn by the story of its mysterious discovery and the man who built the incredible machine it once powered. If you've made it this far, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from as you join us on this journey of mysteries and unexplained stories. Your participation is fundamental for our community to grow stronger every day. If this story sparked your curiosity and you want to continue exploring the world's most intriguing mysteries, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you won't miss any of our daily stories, because every day we bring new cases that will make you question everything you thought you knew about reality. Until the next video, and remember, the truth is always closer than we imagine.